you know.
Yeah. I know, I agree.
So
Okay, we got 8 folks in the waiting room, so I'm
Oh,
gonna,
good. Okay.
yeah, I'm gonna
I
let
was
them
getting
in now.
nervous. We were all alone. Oh, yeah.
No, they're
Just
coming.
us.
And I'm gonna take us live to Facebook too momentarily. So here we go. Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us. And we're live on Facebook, just for everyone's information. You can see my screen, right? Okay,
Yes.
great.
And Sean, Teresa Pelosi, who's in the room, she's the one who just needs some time to speak today before you get
Perfect.
started.
Well, thanks for joining us this evening for Just Talk, Parents Who Matter. Before we get started, I'm going to hand it to Teresa to say a couple remarks and remind you all about some programming at the school.
Thanks so much, Sean. Thanks to everybody who's on. This is a very important topic, and thanks to Sean for agreeing to speak to everybody this evening. Lori and I just wanted to talk to you guys about our upcoming auction gala. This year it's going to be Friday, April 29th at Above Rooftop in Ballroom. We're really excited that we're going to be able to gather and celebrate together. The theme is bourbon, bow ties, and boas. It's looks like it's going to be really fun. People are excited, but I wanted to bring your attention to the auction website that you can get on by going to sia.givesmart.com. We've started to load some of the. Are you putting up cue cards?
Yeah, look.
You can't see it.
Yes, you
Well,
can.
I can't. Anyway, they are discounted tickets right now. There's 3 raffle boards. There's best of auction. There's the 52 card $100 raffle for the really nice Valentino canvas bag. But the most important thing is we want everyone to be there and participate. This has really been a tough 2 years for everybody, and we really want to celebrate in a big way with all of you. And that's it. If you have any questions, you can always call us. You can actually stop by now if you have your mask on and just make an appointment. We'd love to see you. That's it. Turning it back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
So, let me introduce myself first and foremost. My name is Sean. I'm the Behavioral Health Manager at the Staten Island Partnership for Community Wellness. I'm be presenting this evening with 2 colleagues from the coalition, so I'll hand it to Amanda to introduce herself.
You were going to go Jazmin first. Hi, I'm Amanda Wexler. I am a clinical social worker, and I work in the district attorney's office currently as the director for his diversion and victim services programs, which I'll tell you a little bit about as we go through. Prior to coming here, I was a counselor, a therapist in outpatient drug treatment settings, and did that for about 13 years with kids and adults. Glad to be here, and I'll pass it to Jazmin.
Hi all, my name is Jazmin Rivera. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the Staten Island Partnership for Community Wellness, where Sean also works, and I am the Project Director for TISA, the coalition that pulled together this presentation and does a lot of work around substance use prevention and mental health promotion on Staten Island that I think Sean will tell you more about, or one of us as we talk. I have 2 screens, so if it's disorienting, I'm looking at you over here, but my slides are over here, so that's why I'm looking a different way. And I am the parent of small children and a 13-year-old. So if I turn off the camera and run away, it's because someone's trying to crawl out of their bed. But I'm glad to see so many folks here, and we're excited to get into this conversation.
Yes, and so we are the 3 of us and many others. We formed the TISA coalition, we are a coalition here on Staten Island of individuals and organizations that work collectively to improve the behavioral health of young people on the island. So that specifically means improving their mental health outcomes and decreasing substance use. So this is one of the many offerings that we create to help support folks in the community. So I'll hand it to Jazmin to get us going.
I think we're sharing. I think I might roll. Yes, Jazz. I'm going to put some phone numbers in the chat for everyone. So just to frame a little bit of this conversation, I'm certain many, if not all of you, are aware that we're struggling with a serious substance use issue in our country and in particular on Staten Island. Right now, we're seeing a tremendous amount of overdose this year. Last year, we've been on the increase, which has been frightening, and we're starting to see drugs like fentanyl and other analogs, which we'll explain more about later, showing up in lots of different other drugs on Staten Island, non-opioid drugs. So we have a scary situation on our hands because even people who are not using opioids like heroin or drugs of that nature are still suffering an opioid overdose because that's what fentanyl is. So we're going to get into that. What I'm putting in the chat right now is my name, my email, and my phone number, and my colleague Floyd. Floyd Miller is a person in long-term recovery himself and is just a great resource should anybody need that information. So please write it down, put it in your email, because we just had 2 parents this weekend who contacted us and had been way overcharged in thousands and thousands of dollars to get their adult children into treatment unnecessarily. We don't want anybody to do that. Please give our numbers out. We do this for free. It's part of our job. And we talked to 2 moms for the entire weekend just to get them connected. We dropped off Narcan overdose reversal kits at their homes. And it's like sad to even say this out loud, but there's scam artists around on Staten Island that are getting people at their most vulnerable. So please give out our numbers, keep TISA the information that we're going to give because they're connected to all of the providers as well. And we can assist you as part of our job without even billing your insurance and definitely not charging you any money to do so. So that's sort of framing where we're coming at this today. We want to talk about this conversation because substance use issues do not begin typically when people are adults. These are things that we need to start talking about when our kids are young. And as Jazz said, she has little kids. I have a 7 and a 4-year-old. These are things that we're already talking about in my home, and not different levels for different ages, but we got to start somewhere, right? And starting when a kid is 10 is fine if we haven't done it. Starting when they're 5 is even better in different terms. That's what we're going to talk about a bit today. So why have this conversation, right? If you take a peek at this slide, this is talking about it. Kids who are learning about the risks of drugs and that there is a risk to using drugs or alcohol at home are significantly less likely to use. So there's been research on this topic, right? That parents and caregivers who are having this conversation with their kiddos, those kids are less likely to develop a significant issue with drugs and alcohol. So there's a ratio to that, like a direct correlation between having the conversation and lowering the likelihood that that kid will use. So we have some data here for you that 55% of part of the projects that TISA and SIPCW do is to interview young people on Staten Island. So out of one of those surveys, we found that 55% of 7th to 12th graders, so we're talking what, 11-ish, 12-ish to 18-ish on Staten Island have said that their parents did not talk to them about the dangers of alcohol. So we're hearing from the kids that the message isn't getting in, and we want that message to be getting in. You could go to the next slide, Sean. So kids, oops, I gotta move my thing here too. 9 out of 10 people with a drug or alcohol problem started using as a teen. So when we talk to people in treatment, and I'm talking about the people who get to treatment typically have a lot going on. People are not walking in when things are going well for them. And so when we talk to these folks, they're telling us, yeah, I started this when I was 12, 11, 10. Sometimes we can't believe the age that they're telling us they were taking nips of somebody's alcohol, a parent's alcohol, or taking pills out of the cabinets. So we're hearing that it's starting early on, and it's not something that always starts off as a huge problem. Sometimes it's hidden for a long time before we recognize what's going on. So 9 out of 10 people started using as a teen, but kids who are able to delay the onset of their drug use are typically less likely to develop a problem as an adult. So you can move ahead, Sean. So when we talk about people who are misusing substances, if we can delay the age that they start that, they're less likely to develop an addiction issue. So when we hear people saying, you know, they're dabbling, right? A lot of times the conversation, for those of you who have teens in the audience, the conversation I'll have with teens is about delay. How, you know, I know that you're thinking about this. I'm not saying never do it, but, you know, I am saying that we should talk about the risks if we do it now. It's a trickier and a more nuanced conversation. The best message that we can put across is that it's dangerous, that this is a risky thing and not something that we want to engage in. We can move ahead. So this slide always gets me confused sometimes. I'm going to go slow for my own sake. When there is a high perception of risk and a high perception of disapproval, social, meaning from friends, from parents, from family, kids have a lower rates of substance use. So what that means is when they think that this is going to be a problem, this is going to cause problems for them, this is dangerous, and when they are perceiving their parents you know, as saying, we don't want you to do this, this is not something that's okay in my home, they're less likely to do it. And I know, you know, we feel like what we say to our kids is not going in, it's like bouncing around. And like where I tell my kids I'm talking to the wall, I'll say, hey wall, please tell Charlie that I need to talk to him. Like that, we feel like that's what's happening, but it's getting in there. And we see that from some of this data coming out of the conversations. On the flip side, when kids don't perceive a lot of risk, they think that this is not a dangerous activity and they don't think anybody cares if they do it or not, they're more likely to have a substance use issue. So we're seeing that relationship here. And what we want to take away from that is knowing that we want our kids to know that we don't want them to use drugs, right? So that message can be very clear. And I know sometimes people feel funny about that. Like I want them to know that it's okay if they're in my house, or if I'm having a party in the basement, at least I know where they are, right? These are some of the messages that I hear from parents, and it actually sends a mixed, confusing message to teenagers. They hear this and then they think like, oh, well, she must think it's okay, or dad must think it's okay because he's saying I can do it when I'm here. It's actually illegal to provide or allow for a party like that with kids who are not yours, right? So that's a problem. And then the second thing is this perception that kids have of what's allowable in their family and what's risky. So this next slide is a media campaign that we did in TISA, and I sort of had to take pause the first time I saw it for myself. And this is something I talk about on a regular basis, but I recognized that some of these things were things that I had said out loud. So, you know, recognizing that it's tricky and it's not something that we always pay good attention to. These are some of the things that we say in normal conversation and our kids overhear. What they're getting from some of these messages is like, I don't know how to have a good time, or I feel so stressed, and coping with substances, right? That has a longer term message than just what it happens for an adult. And especially because adults, and not that this is something that's so easy to explain, but for adults, it's not having the same impact as somebody who's young, right? The same reasons that drugs and alcohol aren't legal until kids are older. So does anybody have any?
Amanda, can I just give an example for the perception, the seesaw? Because like Amanda said, it's visually, we try to use that seesaw to help people see what we're trying to do, but it's confusing. So like a very specific example, and Sean, do you want to go back to the seesaw just so we're looking at I haven't seen a seesaw in many moons actually at a playground. So we're thinking about this high perception of risk, right? So, and Amanda will give a great example, like a drug. So a high perception of risk, heroin, is something that people generally think is a pretty risky substance to use, right? So we know that our kids probably think that heroin is a dangerous substance. We also know that our kids probably think that their friends and their family would say, please don't use heroin, right? Like we know there's a high risk of disapproval in their social group, from their family, from their peers. So kids are less likely to use a substance like heroin. That's not a substance that people usually initiate substance use with. But something like alcohol, to Amanda's point about this idea of having parties in the basement, of parents talking about drinking to relax, there's more likely for kids to use a substance like alcohol because there's a low perception of risk. It can't be that dangerous because mom and dad use it and they say we can have parties in the basement. And there's a low perception of social disapproval. So they think that it's okay, right? And we're seeing that happen also with marijuana legalization and cannabis, because people think that it's generally a much safer drug and there's not a lot of issue with it. We see that use potentially going up. So that's a very specific example of how this confusing seesaw can work.
It's mostly my issue with the seesaw, I think. Not everyone's. You can go to the next one, Sean. So when is the human brain fully developed? Take a second and throw it in the chat. What age do you think the brain is done growing? Got a 25, 25s. You guys are like right on it. So that's right. It is from 24 to 25 years old is when our human brain is done growing. So what does that mean for us? That if we are trying to learn how to make decisions, learn how to use judgment, even just the general connections that are happening in a brain, when we interrupt that with chemicals, we don't reach our potential. So sometimes that's how I'll talk about it with teenagers too, is, we want to think about where we're trying to go. And if we start using these substances, that some of which, as Jazmin said, are interpreted as not very risky, there's a reason that we don't want it in our bodies until we're older. And the same reason that, caffeine is not recommended, and it's stopping what's already developing there. So what's shifted, right? Because I feel like some of this, when I talk to people who grew up in the 70s, earlier, there's this concept of like, well, I knew a lot of people who did drugs, it wasn't an issue, and they're fine. The drugs of today are not the drugs that were happening back then, and the weed of today is not, the cannabis of today is not the cannabis of earlier times. But also the pressures going on for kids, it's very different than when we were younger. So yeah. So if we look here, right, we just put some up, but I spoke at South Richmond High School on Monday of last week, and the kids in that school are having some kind of struggle, either legally or they have a long-term suspension, lots of different things. And we asked them this question, like, what are some of the stressors that you're facing? And there was so much more than things that I even, that we threw up here, that we have lots of kids who are even struggling with homelessness and don't know where their next meal is coming from and rely on other people or systems to make sure that they get fed. And that's, outside of, I was just thinking of this when we were presenting it, but all of these other things, social media didn't exist when I was a kid. I can't imagine, I would have been in so much more trouble than I already was. Like, I can't imagine what that's like. And as parents, navigating that world with our kids is stressful. We're trying to figure out what the boundary is and when it's appropriate and how many hours, and do we take phones away at night or do they keep phones? It also puts extra pressure on all of these other things, because you used to be able to go home and just be home, but now we're home, but we still are connected to all of these other things that are happening. So why does this matter, right? Because when we're having trouble coping and when, these things are affecting my day-to-day life, and I have this concept that if I use a substance, I know that it makes me feel better. It's a recipe for disaster if kids, are learning to cope that way. So can you pop up the little bubbles? We put two things up here that this one is always a little shocking, but nearly 1 in 5 Staten Island youth reported using drugs and alcohol before their last sexual encounter. So we're talking about decision-making, right? Would that same decision have been made had drugs or alcohol not been involved? And we just threw up that PSA there that we want parents to know to lock up your medicine cabinet, lock up your liquor cabinet, not make these things so accessible, because we are still hearing about kids who go in, you know, the medicine cabinet, look for old medicines. And sometimes it's not even your kid, it's their friends that comes in and is looking around because that's what they're doing. So we have methods to get rid of medications also that we'll talk about at the end, that there's drop boxes in pharmacies around Staten Island. So you can literally take everything in your cabinet and get rid of it if you don't want it in your house anymore. And it's a safe way to, you know, it won't affect the fish or our water or any of that. And it's a safe way to get rid of old meds. What do we do about all of this, right? I'm sorry, I forgot about this one. Vulnerabilities. So we know that the landscape is already tricky for kids on Staten Island right now. And I can even talk so much more about the trauma that Staten Island has been through between 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, and how these things have affected just our Staten Island culture in general, and like feeling out of control of what's happening in our environment. There's other things that can add to a child's vulnerability, and these are some of them. So having a family history of substance use, whether it's spoken about or not. So genetically, it can pose an extra vulnerability. And if it's active in the environment, that also can pose a vulnerability. When kids have close friends who use drugs or alcohol. So it's something to know about, right? I try to talk about, like, we are who our friends are. So we want to know who those kids are. You're in a network of parents here. Is there ways that to exchange that information? I'm sure you guys can tell me better than I can tell you how you're dealing with that. Early first substance or alcohol use. So again, we want to delay that, because the earlier that is initiated, the more likely to develop an issue. Problems in school and learning disabilities. So that stressor can be extra for kids and create more vulnerability. Youth who identify as LGBTQ+, that community struggles with coping. I shouldn't say that. There's extra stress there because of what's happening, and feeling like maybe I don't fit in, or, you know, my family, and the different things that can be happening within their, you know, coming out, etc. And so that's another area that we like to pay attention to. And again, these are just red flags. They're not, just because one of these boxes is checked doesn't equal anything. It's just something to say, okay, I want to pay attention to this, because I know that's something that can, you know, be worth looking at. So that's like the scary stuff. But then we also like to talk about what protective factors exist that can mitigate some of this. So even though we know somebody has a setup where it could progress into addiction, there's lots of things that can be done, and we want to be able to talk about that so that parents can be armed with some of that information. So what's happening on Staten Island? Top substances that you think are being used in the community. If you want to throw a guess in there, or if anybody wants to share, you can feel free to do that. And then we're going to share with you. Yes, we are seeing a lot of marijuana use. Alcohol and heroin, yes. You can move to that next one. Jazz, you want to do this one? I feel like you're better at it.
Sure, maybe because I'll go fast. But basically what this is telling us, and the reason why we ask this question really is because sometimes we think that, especially in this age group, like middle and high school, that the top substance happening is heroin. And we do know that while that's an issue, it's much less of an issue in this specific age group. So we see that alcohol is always the most used substance across every age group, always in the world, right? Like, it is just the most readily available substance. It's legal, it's the most used. And then I know that someone said cannabis. So we see marijuana coming up as the next used substance, and binge drinking being the most dangerous form of drinking also happening more than we'd like to see in a younger age group. And then we see prescription drugs happening. So opioid use, stimulant use, and tranquilizer use, but it being much less. So that's great in this middle and high school age range that we're not seeing as much of that use of these quote unquote harder substances. But we do see, and we'll get to a next slide where we see this transition happening a bit as young folks are getting a little bit older. So that 18 to 25-year-old age range, we do see some of these substances like prescription drugs and heroin increasing a bit. So like Amanda was talking about, this idea of risk and protective factors, exposure to different substances, alcohol and marijuana or cannabis is where folks usually start. And then we see that potential progression onto harder or those other substances that we don't see in this younger age group. And I just want to note this, it's not in this data yet in these slides, but we do see in another data set that some other drugs like methamphetamines are actually happening on Staten Island in ways that we weren't thinking about before. So it's important for us to know what is going on because we can't plan effective prevention strategies if we don't know. And another thing that I'm sure that folks are aware of that's not on here is vaping. So that's not in the purview really of this conversation, but vaping is really an issue in this age group as well. And we're hearing from schools that it's definitely happening in middle schools more often than it was a few years ago. So that's something to be aware of too.
Yeah,
and so
what Jazmin, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you take it, Amanda. Go.
What Jazmin referenced, and I think this is a really good way to picture it, right? So when I was in high school, I heard about not vaping yet, cigarettes, beer, wine. Some kids would move on to smoking weed and drinking hard liquor. And then a very small amount would progress into these other categories that we have here. But what happened sometime in the early 2000s is we had the introduction of prescription pain medications. And part of what happened here is some of these medications, and we're going to speak more specifically, if you're using them for even a couple of weeks every day, they can cause a dependency, right? So meaning if you try to stop taking them, they make you feel sick. So what we started to see is that there was this abundance of pills on Staten Island and in the nation. People were taking them even as prescribed, but doctors were prescribing them in high quantities. So we had like people who had a tooth removed and they got 300 Vicodin. We saw people with ACL surgeries or back injuries, and they were getting all of these Percocet and OxyContin. So what happened there is the medications on the street, because you'd run out of your prescription, right? And your doctor would say, well, you don't need any more and you should just move on. But what happened, there became a street market for this, and the pills are really expensive, and they still are. So a lot of people jumped quickly from the prescription medications to heroin because it has the same impact. So if you're in withdrawal from prescription opioids, which is Percocet, oxycodone, OxyContin, hydrocodone, all of the morphine class of drugs, you can use heroin and it will stop those withdrawal symptoms. So as much as it sounds like a weird thing that this could happen so easily, when you're sick, it's just not that weird. You're crushing a pill and sniffing it while heroin comes in a powder, and I'm going to sniff that too. And so it's sort of an easier step. I even had people who would eat a pill, sniff a line of heroin. And so, the progression is slow. And I think that's what makes it so tricky, because a lot of people they don't jump into it saying, I hope I become dependent on this. They are taking pills, they're feeling sick, they want to be able to go to school or work or football practice, and they say, all right, I got to get through the day. I'll just do this for one more day. And a lot of times that's how we roll into a really serious dependency. And yeah, I saw, if people have questions, feel free. We're gonna, you can drop them in the chat or send them to Sean and we'll address them. Now we're gonna talk a bit more specifically about some of the substances. These are just 3 examples of pills. These pills come in all different forms. So if you find a stray pill around your house, put it into Google, right? So you see in this blue pill with the 10 on it, if you put that into Google, you can find out, it'll pop up what pill it is and you can match it. You also can bring it to a pharmacist and say, like, help me out. It's important to do that because we want to be accurate about what's going on. So here you're seeing in that first column, pain relievers, Vicodin, OxyContin, and Percocet. Those medications are prescription medications that are given as a painkiller, and they were created to treat terminal cancer. Like this wasn't a drug that was created for long-term use, but it was being prescribed all over the place constantly. I'm sure everyone on this call knows somebody who was prescribed these medications because that's what was happening. It was just being pushed. And then we reeled it in and we said, okay, some laws were passed that we couldn't prescribe more than a certain amount. And we sort of moved into this world where there was a lot of people using heroin just to cope with the withdrawal. Stimulants are that second bunch, Adderall and Ritalin. We're still seeing those around. I see a pretty consistent amount of arrests on a monthly basis for people who are buying and selling stimulants. And then benzodiazepines, which is another name for medications that treat anxiety. So Xanax, Valium, Ativan, Klonopin, all of those medications are narcotics, meaning that they can be dependency building, and they treat anxiety. They are also, can cause issues if you try to stop using them without tapering off. We can move to the next slide. Oh yeah, we have more. We have a drug guide that we can provide if you don't have it already. We like to talk about alcohol because we feel like that, and I'll speak for myself, that it's just minimized, like the risk, and it's seen almost as a rite of passage rather than a substance that people are, engaging with. We have so many young people that report binge drinking. And a lot of times when I talk to young people, I explain to them what a binge is. So for a male, it's 5 to 6 drinks in one sitting. And for a female, it's 4 to 5 drinks in one sitting. And the thing that I always try to point out to them is that one drink is not like how much vodka I pour into a red Solo cup, and that's one drink, right? But instead, it's 1.5 or 1 or 1.5 ounces of hard liquor. It's a 12-ounce beer or 4 ounces of wine. So if I'm drinking, however many glasses of wine a night, that's considered a binge. And what starts to happen is when that behavior is happening on a regular basis, we start to interpret that as just normal behavior, right? And it can become problematic because alcohol has all kinds of different side effects. It's probably the thing that I see cause the most crime on Staten Island. We see a lot of domestic violence related incidents, driving incidents, and other violent incidents that are related to alcohol. With younger people, we like to remind them that it's very dangerous to combine the prescription medications that we were talking about with alcohol. We see a lot of overdoses happen that way because all of them are central nervous system depressants. So what that means is it's slowing down your heart rate and your breathing to the point that you're not breathing anymore. And basically that's what an overdose is. And we'll talk about that some more at the end. So now we can move into vaping, which you guys spoke a little bit about. This slide was shocking to me. It's one of the newer ones that we have in this slideshow. But if you look at how they're marketing vaping products, like they're made for kids. It's disgusting. Like this is what companies are doing to put this out there. So you can see that the vaping product is on the left, and it looks just like cereals and candies and whatever that are marketed for children. So, it's done purposefully. And TISA works on different projects where we try to talk to legislation about these things and say, how is this something that's allowable? We had a similar issue with Four Loko a couple of years ago. Those were the tall drinks that were making kids act completely wild and weird and like vomit everywhere and just feel terrible. And they were like neon colors. They looked like they were made for babies. So anyway, this is another piece that we're looking at. Vaping is inhaling, through one of these products that you see here. A lot of people talk about Juuls or juuling that's a specific device, and you can take out, the packet and replace. So they are not better alternatives to cigarettes. This was like the perception initially, but we're seeing all kinds of lung problems happening because you're not supposed to be putting liquid in your lungs, right? And that's what vaping is. Like you're inhaling a liquid in that form. So they're seeing things in the emergency rooms called popcorn lung, and then things associated with anxiety that kids are struggling with as a side effect of vaping. So yikes. And the next slide, again, it's like a little bit shocking, but it's showing us a comparison of New York City data and Staten Island data. So I don't like to be winning in these categories, but in the drug categories, like we are struggling on Staten Island, and we look much more like the places in Ohio and West Virginia that you hear about than we look like the rest of New York City. In the data. So you can see here that we have New York City, 15.2% of high school youth reported using a vape in the past 30 days. And on Staten Island, it was 19.9%. Come on, guys. And then all of these other areas, we are also higher than the rest of the city.
And Amanda, I just want to add too, for folks to know that Vaping is just another product in the line of products that are aggressively marketing towards kids. So Amanda did say this idea of the way that they're looking, the flavors, but we know this is an intentional marketing strategy. Like they're trying to get their market hooked on their substance. So vaping younger so that over the life course, your kids are spending a lot of their money on these products. We see this with alcohol too. We did a lot of work to get alcohol ads removed from MTA because we saw that they're intentionally marketing to kids some of these types of alcohol where they're looking very colorful, or we talk about like pink washing, right? Like these like colors and flavors that are for women or for kids. So there's very intentional and nefarious marketing practices behind these things. And it sucks, right? Like they're trying to target us and take our money, right? Like they're trying to get us hooked on their substances so that we will buy them across our life and spend our money. So it's not fair that they're marketing to our children, really. So that's just a scary piece that's attached to the strategies that folks are engaging in when they're trying to sell these products. And then again, like Amanda said, market them as like alternatives to cigarette smoking, like it's better, which these are not good for our kids.
It's just horrendous. Like it makes me upset to even think about it in those terms. And this has done some cool projects with alcohol that I'm sure we're going to be working on replicating in other areas. But we do one during the St. Patrick's Day parade where we had kids going out and putting educational stickers on beer cans or, you know, cases in delis along Forest Avenue so that it was one, educating kids like this, and the stickers would say different facts about alcohol use. But it also was getting the message out there to other people who were buying it. So that's something that kids can get involved in. If you're interested in your kids being involved in these things, please reach out to us. Next, we're going to talk about marijuana. I know there's a lot of feelings about this, and particularly with the legalization that we're trending towards. And do people overdose from marijuana? No. So I don't talk about it in terms of like the same level of danger, so to speak, but I have never met someone who uses, who has a serious drug use issue and didn't start with marijuana and alcohol. So the risk to me is like, we start in one place and this progression happens so slowly with drug use that we don't notice the difference. So there's like an allegory about this of a frog in a pot of cold water, that if a frog is in a pot of cold water and you turn the stove on, it will boil to death because it doesn't notice the change in the temperature of the water. And this is sort of the same thing. I meet tons of people who are like, I don't know how I got here. And when we trace back through their history, it starts with little stuff. Now, not every person who smokes marijuana or uses marijuana ends up having a serious drug issue. That's not my point. But the point is that we don't know who will. And so when we're looking at young people, like delay is better. It's just better because we're trying to introduce some of those protective factors so that they're not struggling in the future. And we can talk more about the legal pieces of this because we're seeing increased use among youth. That's hard to say with a mouthful of braces. We're moving in that direction in New York City. Okay. Thank you, Sean. So this is a slide about heroin. As we said, heroin is another opioid that sounds very frightening, but really is a very small step from the painkillers that we take, that people take for, surgeries and stuff. Heroin is typically snorted at first. So it comes in a powder, like I said, and generally people don't start with injection, and many people don't even make it to injection. When people do make that move, and we have some projects across the city where we're just trying to help people not start injecting, because we see that happens among friends. Like one friend teaches another friend how to do this. It's very, very risky. And it's risky right now even to snort it because the fentanyl that's in our system, in our drugs, is so deadly that it's just killing people. I can't even say enough how dangerous these drugs are. And right now we're seeing it in other things. So we're seeing fentanyl in cocaine, fentanyl in crystal meth, fentanyl in Xanax that's purchased on the street. So if you think about that, a person who uses cocaine, they're not worried about overdosing. They don't use opiates. So cocaine is an upper. That's like, well, I'm going to go out and party all night type of drug. So the idea that I'm going to have that type of reaction, many people who use cocaine don't even have Narcan in their house. because it's not something that they worry about. Whereas when you're a person who has an opiate problem, that's something you're familiar with. You know about Narcan, you know about how to reverse an overdose. So we've been trying to give this education to as many people as possible. And like I said, I dropped off Narcan kits to parents over the weekends because they found out their child was using a substance that was not heroin. And I was like, listen, let me just bring them to you because I'll hate myself if something happens and I didn't have this conversation with you. So we want people to have as much of that information as possible. Heroin itself is very dangerous on its own. And with the introduction of fentanyl, we're just at a new level. So what do we do about all of this? We have all of this drug information. How do we prevent it from happening? We always like to start with the conversation, right? And we're going to get into that a bit more deeply. The best things that you can do is learn about it, which is what everyone is doing here tonight. Know what's going on in your community, which is what we're sharing. And we all have mailing lists that you can get on. The DA, my office puts out a mailing list on a regular basis with some of this information, and SIPCW does as well. And we want to pay attention that it's not the same world that we grew up in. The drugs are not the same. So thinking in terms of like, I knew so-and-so and he's doing okay is not a good way to approach this issue right now. So how do we do this? We want to be able to clearly communicate the risks. Sometimes that takes practice, and that's okay. Talk about it with friends, talk about it with us, talk about it with therapists. There's lots of people who want to help us be able to have this conversation. And we want to express the disapproval, right? So that's what we said before about be clear that this is not acceptable. When we make it confusing, kids get confused and they don't understand the nuance to what we're saying. Using teachable moments. So when something presents itself, go ahead and talk about it. Don't hold back from those conversations. And it's okay even to say, like, I need to think about this and I'm going to come back to this conversation, but make sure you come back to it, right? That's an important thing. We want to be able to talk and listen to what our kids are saying. And I can speak for myself. It's tricky. I am working. I am in school. I have 2 little kids, and sometimes, like, I don't even know. Sometimes I have to tell my kids to start over because I wasn't even paying attention. It's something that, I try to prioritize as best as I can. And even if it's not every minute that I'm with them, which it's not, I do my best to make sure that there's times where I'm checking in and really listening to what they're saying, not just sitting there. If you have past use of drugs or alcohol in your history, that's okay. It's okay to talk about those things. Those are some of the teachable moments that we can share. And if people have that specific concern, please feel free to reach out to some of our partners. They're so happy to prepare you to talk about that kind of situation. We want to teach kids refusal skills. So literally role playing, right? And I know they hate it. Make them do it anyway. The more that they practice, the easier it comes out when they're in that situation. And make a plan for how they can call you. So sometimes they're embarrassed, right? How can we make up another? I've heard parents do such amazing creative things to help their kids get out of situations, like make up those fun, silly ones that, and then practice them so that they know that they have an out and they don't have to do this thing if they don't, that's being presented to them. So,
Amanda, I also want to add to, just like Amanda said this, but just hammering home, when you're talking about preventing drug use in your home, you're not always talking about drugs. Like Amanda's talking about talking to her little people, right? It's like having conversations at the dinner table, making sure once a week you're having dinner, and maybe you have a movie night, like having these family times, or having these, maybe it's just in the car when you drive your kids to school or pick them up or take them to softball practice or whatever. It's like just spending that time communicating about many things, so that when drugs are the thing that you're talking about, you're already prepared and that like muscle for communication has worked. And also wanted to add to that, we often use, like TISA as a coalition, use different forms of current media as like a teaching tool or a conversation tool. So I'm going to say it right now, we're watching Euphoria. So in season 1, we were using Euphoria with college students, they were older, to talk about things like consent, to talk about substance use, to talk about mental health. So for us as parents, it's really important to know about like what's happening in pop culture and media so that we can talk to our kids about it, and not just like, I don't want you watching that, but hey, I know you saw this episode and this happened. Like, what do you think about that? Do you have friends who are taking medication for their anxiety? Like things like that. So it's important to know what's going on in the world too, so that we can have conversations about those things as well.
Yeah. But why does this matter? The first little graph here is showing us that the perception of parental disapproval for, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, having 1 to 2 drinks nearly every day. So we have a high rate of parental perception of disapproval. So kids in 7th and 8th grade, 96.9% of them think their parents are not going to be happy if they're having 1 to 2 drinks nearly every day. But you see that perception of risk goes down the older the kid gets. Some of that is that they're learning from things around them, like, oh, so-and-so had this thing and he didn't even get in trouble, or I snuck this or that and my mom said it was cool. So they're picking up those little cues along the way as well, and learning from those situations. But it's also, they get older. Are we talking to them as much? Does the conversation change? So we have to kind of hold the line with that as best as we can. And then Jess, can you help me with this one? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so, and these are, we took this out, I think, the next iteration of the slides, but the numbers are whatever the numbers say, but the purpose really of this is to show that on the left side, we're looking at perception of parental disapproval. So kids, even though it goes down a bit, generally kids, over 90% of kids from 7th to 12th grade think that their parents don't want them to drink every day, right? Like that's a no-go. But we see that the older kids get, they think that their parents won't have as many consequences if they are using alcohol, right? So they're like, the older you get, it's like in 7th grade, kids are like, 40% of kids think there are major consequences if their parents caught them drinking alcohol, but in 12th grade, only 16% of kids think there is a major consequence of their parent catching them drinking alcohol. So it's really to say that we need to set these boundaries, set these limits, and Amanda will talk about this a bit when we talk about the steps to prevent use, but it's so important that we're communicating our disapproval, and not that we're trying to make our kids fear us or think that they're going to get grounded or whatnot, but think that there's actually some type of consequence if they are using substances, because we go back to that seesaw. If there's that high perception of risk and high perception of parental disapproval, there's that lower use. So just trying to hammer home that we're having these conversations, we're letting our kids know that we don't want them to use substances, alcohol, drugs, anything, and having some consequences attached if we do find alcohol in their rooms, or those things that are going to happen as kids get older. And also, the last thing I'll say about this, because I know we have to go, is that it's just so important. The older our kids get, of course, they're getting closer to adulthood, right? But in high school, especially, these are critical moments in our children's brain development. And that's when we're often letting go because they're more mature and they're tall, they look like adults, we think they can handle it. But that's really when we need to provide them with a lot more support and structure and be there for them, because they're not asking for things the same way they are when a man or I 4-year-olds are like, Mommy, I'm hurt, I want you to play with me, right? Like when your kid is 15, they don't say things like that to you, even though they still need those things. So having that as much support and high touch conversations, even in high school, is still so critical.
What do we do about all of this? These are some tips for you to help monitor. We want to know, and some of them are simple and things that you've heard before. Know who your kid is with, know what they're doing, where they're going, when they're expected to be home. It's okay to say, you're not allowed to just go hang out. I don't know what that is. You need to have a purpose. So some of those sort of more, I guess, old school things that used to happen are okay to expect. Know who the friends are and communicate with their parents, even if you don't like them. It's important to have those relationships, because you can start to talk about all of this together and, go at it together. Know how money is being spent. Sometimes giving a kid $10 every day and not knowing what they're coming back with. So that's something to check out and ask them about it. What did you spend that on? What did you eat? You can make it playful, to find out. And then establish and enforce those rules. There's a clear no use policy. And I know sometimes people are afraid, oh, if I say that, then they're not going to tell me. That's where opening the lines of communication becomes important. That it's not about not talking to me. It's about this behavior not being acceptable. And we can move to the next one. So a lot of people ask, how do I know that something has started, right? And teens are tricky because they're already acting a little weird. So we're looking for changes, big changes, and multiple of them, right? So declining school grades, or even how their output is. And you've known them, you're the expert in your kids. So what have they been doing all this time, and what are they suddenly doing now? An abrupt change in friend groups. Again, something to pay attention to, not necessarily the answer, but something to pay attention to. Changes in appearance, hygiene, sleeping during class, or other activities, and changing in their participation. Like, I don't want to do dance anymore. I don't want to do anything anymore. We just want to pay attention to those things and start asking some questions. And then what do you do once you see that something is happening? Yeah, you can go to the next one. What do we do? So what we always want to sort of take that breath and know that we can have this conversation. And if it's not a good day for you to have the conversation, that's okay. It can happen the next day. You want to be ready for it, because once we start it, we don't want to sort of backtrack. We want to stick with what we're doing. You want to communicate your disapproval and set limits, right? So these are the rules of my home. These are the consequences if you don't follow those rules. If you struggle with that and need help to be creative, again, we have tons of providers on Staten Island that are happy to talk about this with you. And I've heard such amazing things, like parents who have locked all of their daughters' like hair and makeup stuff in a big trunk, and they have to earn them back one by one, which for this particular kid was very motivational. And we can get creative. It doesn't always have to be the same sort of rubric for your kid. Then we want to monitor. I have parents who track behavior on a calendar. They write down, like, this night looked like this night looked like this. And that helps them just to maintain what was going on. And if you feel like you need assistance, that's okay. Again, the providers on Staten Island are so wonderful and really dedicated to this mission. So it will not be weird for you to call them and say, I don't know what's going on. I need assistance with this. And again, you don't have to pay a ton of money to do that. There are people who will help you for no money. So those are our recommendations. And then there's lots of options that we have within our community and within schools. So I don't know about your school in particular, if you have a SAPIS, that's a specific substance abuse professional who can assist with these conversations. It's okay if not. There's public schools that have them and some that don't. Guidance counselors, social workers, school nurses. There's programs that can bring programming to the school. So if this was something you were interested in having your kids work on a regular basis, the YMCA, the UAU, they have prevention programs that they bring into schools to do the programs with the kids regularly, which show some prevention, drug and alcohol prevention. And then across Staten Island, we have tons of resources. So we if we haven't already, we'll send you that information. I put my phone number and Floyd's phone number in the chat. Please use us for that. And then lastly, we have the drug take-back program, which I told you about. There's a bunch of locations on Staten Island, police precincts, and then a few pharmacies where you can bring any medications back. And it looks like a big mailbox. So like you just go and put the pills in. There's no questions. They will just take them. So these are the areas, the places on Staten Island that do that. And like I said, it's no questions asked about that. The last thing is about naloxone. I saw that Sean put in the chat that TISA is doing naloxone trainings on a monthly basis. So if this is the overdose reversal drug, it looks like Flonase. It cannot hurt someone if you give it to them and they're not overdosing. So meaning if someone who, has become unresponsive, you administer Narcan because you don't know what's going on and it's a heart attack, let's say, the Narcan won't make anything worse. It will just do nothing. Its whole job is to knock the opioids off the person's brain so that they start breathing again. And we can train people, we can even train kids and teens. So if people are interested in having that, we just like to have a lot of this out there because we never know who is struggling and who isn't. So please feel free to ask us about that. And then there's 4 agencies on here that are also trained to provide it. So some of them will come to your house and bring it to you if you need it. And lastly, we have a list of resources. Some of these are self-help groups. Some of these are citywide, like NYC Well, you can call that 888 number and get a counselor on the other end. And then some have more formal treatment programs. And of course, you always have us. So what can we answer? Questions, comments?
And while folks are thinking of if while folks are preparing questions, if I could just pitch, we have a family prevention pledge that that I just dropped in the chat that kind of reinforces a lot of the things that we just talked about over the last hour. Actionable tips on what you can do in the home to prevent substance use. If you're interested, I would encourage you to click on that link and sign the pledge. It signs you up for an email list, and you will continue to get resources from TISA on supporting your young one with substance use or mental health challenges. So, any questions from folks? Any last words, Jazmin, you want to share at all?